her new young adult nonfiction book, Everything I Learned About Racism I Learned in School, highlights inequities that Black and brown students face from preschool through college. And it is extraordinarily important reading. And I'm so glad that she's joining us today. Thank you so much for being here, Tiffany. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
I am excited because I got to be honest with you. We've been hearing so much about books that have to be banned. There's so much fear about, whether or not we are exposing children to topics that are just going to destroy their mentality. And yet you wrote a whole book
I know.
this that's aimed at young children. You walk us through in this book your own educational upbringing and give us a little sense as to some of the moments that you experienced personally when you learned that subtle racism was actually at active play when you were in school.
I always like to share the first kind of awakening was when I was in third grade, which is appropriate because 9-year-olds are starting to go beyond themselves and notice the world more around them. And I had a teacher, I wrote about this in my first book too. I had a teacher who was just much more overtly racist than other teachers in the way she talked about her own kids' suburban school that was much better funded than our city school. The way she spoke to my Black and brown peers. And that was kind of the, oh my goodness, this moment, it's so clear in my head. My mom remembers me coming home too and being like, my teacher said this. And then there were just other moments, like being tracked in middle school and being for the first time in a class with more white kids than Black and brown kids. And I was like, what is going on? Where are all the kids from my elementary school? And why are they in the classrooms that are hallways away? And it was just it was a lot of noticing and a lot of I'm a questioner. So it was a lot of questions, but nobody ever shared answers.
Right.
So I wrote a book to share some of those answers.
I'd like how you framed that. There was a lot of noticing because I think that's what happens a lot in this society. We see things, we observe things, but rarely do we engage in the language that would be required for us to discuss them or to
Right.
unpack them in meaningful ways. And so I remember similarly, I was about, third grade, similar situation. It wasn't necessarily that frame, but, learning about slavery with that little, page and a half in the book and how it made me feel in that moment. And what you talk about is something that I think resonates with so many of us. And I want to come back to this idea of age appropriate, right? Because one of the big things that groups there are a whole number of books. We don't even have to name them and give them air. But one of the things that they say is that, well, we don't want to introduce these topics to children. They're not age appropriate and they're going to make them feel guilty about a lot of things. To which as a parent, I'm like, well, my child is wondering, my child is noticing and observing things. What prevents your child from being exposed to difficult topics, but can't also prevent my child from being exposed to difficult topics? How did you grapple with that? Because age appropriateness is it's an underlying current right now that sort of to squelch a lot of the discourse.
Yeah, I'm an educator. I've been teaching for over 20 years. I've studied children. I've studied what's developmentally appropriate. I've worked with children like preschoolers all the way to high schoolers. And so I know kids. I listen to them. They are super aware of the world. And if we don't give them the facts and we engage them when they're curious, then they just create their own answers, which are usually based in stereotypes and usually incorrect and inaccurate. So they notice, they're going to bring it up. And with 3-year-olds, we're not being like, this is what racism is, but we do get to talk about who we are and our identities and get to give them the language to talk about themselves. And then we can also kids know what's unfair. I've been doing a lot of work with kids lately around fairness and justice. And I'm like, what would a world look like that was more fair and just? And they can name it. They know instantly, while adults have a harder time. They're like, I don't know. It would be maybe we could do this. And kids are like, we would have food that's affordable for everybody. Everybody would have housing. We would have our teachers would get paid more. They know, they can name it so fast and quick. So
they're a lot more intelligent than we give them credit for.
they sure
I
are.
think
That
that
is
is
so
definitely
true.
But I like the fact that your response to my question was, well, I'm an educator, right? Because to me, that indicates like there's some level of expertise, right? First of all, there's some,
Mhm.
you didn't just decide, oh, I'm just going to be a teacher and then end up in the classroom. You had to be
Right.
trained for this. I
Right.
am a parent. I also happen to be an educator, but most of my parent friends are not educators. And
Mhm.
I certainly wasn't trained to be an educator in the way that you were through the
Mhm.
formal teacher training program. There's been a real devaluation of the expertise that educators bring into this space.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we have sort of reframed educators as being the enemy
I
of
know.
the enemy of those of us who just want to live without guilt. What are your
Mhm.
thoughts on how we approach the education profession right now?
It's horrible. Like I love teachers, and I think
Mm,
almost all, like majority of teachers, all the teachers that I get to work with are incredible. And what they do with so little money and with no support, and with like, especially after the pandemic, where class sizes have increased, like kids are like missing days and days because they're sick, like they're incredible. And the whole like pitting caregivers against teachers is wild because we're all caring for these children, and children like thrive when they know there's a whole team behind them. And
mm,
so it really like it's so disheartening and it's so frustrating because I love educators, and I'm also a mama, and so like as the mama I get to like, be that person who's like asking my kid like, what did you learn in school today? And also as an educator, I'm like, you know what, some days you just need to spend your day outside. You need to go outside and commune with your community and not sit in your classroom like glued to a smartboard. And that's
mm.
so I think like a lot of caregivers and adults who aren't around children all the time, like the expectations have just gone off. And we're looking at politicians as the experts when they don't know children the same way we do.
Right. That's exactly right. I'm wondering what educators can take from this book, because one of the things I'm also mindful of, or not even just this book, the other books that you have, which include
Mm,
this book is anti-racist and the anti-racist kid. One of the things I'm mindful of is that there are a lot of educators who would like to be able to have these conversations. They would like
mm,
to be able to delve into these difficult topics, but there's a lot of fear, which makes perfect sense considering the
mhm.
fact that you guys have a bullseye on you. But it also is due to the fact that they were not prepared to have those
Yeah.
conversations in meaningful ways in the classroom. What is your advice to educators who want to have an anti-racist approach in the classroom? I mean, and you're seeing this as someone who is a woman of color, you're a
Mhm.
mother, you're an educator, you're an author. How can teachers who were not prepared to engage in this sort of dialogue, what can they do to make sure that they're ready for these moments in the classroom in a way that's going to sort of not just be truthful in that moment, but really speak to who they desire to be as an anti-racist
Right.
educator?
Like I'm hoping educators will from this book take that like we're working in an imperfect system.
Yeah.
One person can't change everything on their own. I was the person, like I was the young teacher who was like, I'm gonna change everything. And then I was like, wait a minute, I'm exhausted and I'm burning out. That we have to do this together. And the like most important thing is I want educators to know who they are. I want them to know their history, the history of the school and the city that they work in, because that like really plays into how schools are run and how they're funded and everything now. So like can't just like appear in a school and you're like, okay, everything's fine. Like there's so much history in our schools. And there's no time for educators to do like I had to dive deep in old newspaper articles and stuff to even figure out who my old school was named after, like
Oh, wow. Right.
so
Right.
and
No.
then like looking at like like how redlining divided neighborhoods, and then like the school or the state mandates for the percentage of Black kids you could have in certain schools, and then like like there's so much history in our districts that we don't know. And a part of this, I was like I emailed people and talked to people in my old city, and like a lot of folks didn't know. And they're like, well, maybe talk to this one history teacher at this high school. Like they do a lot. But there's just like, we're so removed from things. And there's so much that teachers have to do every day. They don't have time to even like think
Mm.
like about like, who was the school named after and why? Um,
Right, right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And the fact that, my daughter, she actually found out her school is named after someone. He was just like a mediocre guy, like had done nothing,
Right.
like really.
As
She was
many
like,
of them are. You're
this?
like, what?
Like, we're walking into a building and this is who it's named after, and I'm supposed to be in this space to be excellent.
Right.
I'm like, yes, you are still supposed to be excellent. For parents who are thinking about this book for their children, what is the target market for this particular book? Everything I learned about racism I learned in school. I know it's for young adults, but I've often seen that a lot of books that are written for young adults, quite frankly, I think are phenomenal for the grown
Hmm.
adults, because young adult writers, you have to be able to capture the imagination in ways that I find that other genres simply just
Right.
don't. Give us a sense as to what you hope, not just young people, but what parents would come away from
Mm.
learning after having engaged with your book.
I hope everyone will see themselves in this book, like see themselves in the story, whether they were like witnessed racism, whether they experienced it, whether they were like a part of of imparting it onto young folks. Um, I want so like my ideally like the kids who read this book is anti-racist are like reading this book and like, okay, we're going deeper into the system that I'm like in all the time, whether I want to be or not. And for the adults, it's like looking at like we have that adult power to make change. So how can we make schools better for all of our students? Like that's what I really want. I just want us all to like collect ourselves and keep fighting for schools to be better, not for places where some people get to be the best and others don't, but where like everybody gets to be their best.
I love that. I saw a post recently that said, for all of you who were considered talented and gifted in the 80s and 90s, how many of you are dealing with your neuroses and your perfectionism? And how many times are you going to therapy, right? This idea
Hmm.
that schools and the tracking and the ways that we divide children, this notion that it has a lasting impact, not just on
Right.
us as individuals, but as a society. I think the idea that schools can be made better and that they
Hmm.
should not be sabotaged and defunded and
Right.
attacked and seen as sort of the
Right.
site of political battle. I think that's what I would like to get back to,
Yeah.
or get to. I don't know that if we were
Right,
ever there.
right.
I'd like
I
to
don't know
get
if we ever
to
were
that.
there. We were there for like a day, maybe in like
Yeah,
1800s.
like
Who knows?
and that was when before we were creating public schools in our
Right,
community. They didn't even exist.
right.